Hi, my friends. I have a video for you today that's a little bit more of a tutorial and a sort of hopefully something that will strike some thinking and some discussions and that might help you read even better. And that's, one of my favorite things to do on this channel. So that's these are my favorite kinds of videos to make. So, what I want to talk with you today about is the idea of looking. I've done this with the majors or the trumps a little bit. I think I did. In fact, I know I did a whole video on this, but I'm going to take it a little further today. And the idea here is we want to look at the cards without judgment, without assigning judgment to what is happening in them in order to make them more readable. And this is something that I think was influenced. I when I started making notes for this video, I realized that there are a lot of influences on me and how I read. I talk about a lot how Robert M. Place's Tarot History, Symbolism, and Divination was a really impactful book, and it's one reason why I never really use one card readings anymore. And there are, obviously 78 Degrees of Wisdom, which I'm going to reference here. But one of the big influences too, and I don't think I really even realized it until I was sitting down to make this video, was Walden Ruth Ann Amberstone's Tarot School Correspondence course, which I never finished, but I did do a lot of. And one of the things they have you do in that course is to describe the cards as an exercise in really looking at all the symbolism behind it. And it's meant to be very specific. I remember sitting with a ruler, and measuring things. Like, that's how specifically we were describing the cards in the correspondence course. This is, I think, inspired by that, but it's taking a different track. And in a sense, it's actually kind of removing a lot of what's been assigned to the cards over the years as a way of starting from neutral, which I talk about a lot, and making the cards make more sense, question mark, I offer sort of hesitantly, because I think where sometimes folks get stuck are being, well, let's just get into it and I'll explain it as I go. All right, so what I want to do is let's take a look at the Ten of Swords, right? The Ten of Swords, famous Rider-Waite-Smith image, probably one of the most viscerally memorable cards. I feel like the Ten of Swords. If you've seen a tarot deck, this is an image that you're gonna remember. And a frequent description of the card includes that the clouds are parting and that the sky is beginning to brighten. And I hear that a lot in readings, and I hear people talking about it a lot, and I absolutely have said it. And the point that I want to get at is that can be a helpful way of looking at the cards, but it's also helpful not to look at them that way. So I'll explain more as I go on. And this is, I think, where one of the downsides of the way most folks learn tarot is from reading a lot of books. There's a lot of great books. There's a lot of geniuses out there. And the thing that happens, though, in a book is you can't contextualize everything in the way that the cards are contextualized. So when you read a book on how to read tarot, you get the cards' individual meanings and descriptions, but you don't necessarily get the examples of how that changes. And so that's a thing that really, really, I think, hamstrings a lot of people because they can't quite get past that. So where does this come from? Where does this idea that the clouds are parting? Because it's not in Waite. So when I thought about this, I went and looked at the pictorial key, and Waite doesn't say anything about the clouds. He basically describes exactly what's here. Well, the earliest I could find this reference, and I didn't do too much research, but I did look in my earliest books, because this is something that's been in my head about as far back as I can remember. It's not just because I've heard other people say it, it's because I've said it too. Well, from what I can tell, it comes from 78 Degrees of Wisdom. And there's a real key thing here that I want to point out. So in 78 Degrees of Wisdom, Rachel Pollack says, notice that in contrast to the 9, the sky clears in the distance, the black clouds give way to sunshine, and that in contrast to the 5 or the 2, the water lies placidly. The situation is not as bad as it looks. So that's just a brief little excerpt from the couple pages on the Ten of Swords. But what I think is really key here to this card and what Rachel Pollack wrote about it is that it's not just in the context of the Ten of Swords. If you notice, Rachel Pollack is actually putting it in the context of other cards. So when you compare the 9 to the 10, the 9 has an entirely black sky, and in the 10, it does, you would say, oh, that's a clearing sky. Same thing with the water. If you look at the water in the 5 and the 2 compared to the water in the 10, it's much stiller. The reason that I'm bringing this up, though, is because she doesn't just assume that the skies are clearing. It's not in the art that that's what's happening. She's looking at the evolution from 9 to 10 in the images that Pamela Coleman Smith drew. And I think that what happens over time is that we remember little nuggets like that, like the clouds are clearing. We don't remember necessarily that it's because it was in context of the evolution from 9 to 10. And so when the 10 of Swords arrives, we say, oh, the clouds are clearing. That is a big value judgment about the card, though. And it can, in some cases, I think, make for a less useful or less accurate reading if we don't look at what Rachel Pollack was actually saying, which is that in contrast to the 9, the clouds are clearing. Now, the 10 of Swords is only in contrast to the 9 either when the deck is in order or when the 9 of Swords is shown up in the reading. But what happens in tarot is that almost always the cards are showing up in context with cards they don't really have any normal relationship with. You know what I mean? There isn't that evolution. It's rare that you would get an 8, 9, 10 of Swords in a spread in that order. You could, certainly. But, most of the time the cards are existing in context with other cards. And that does make reading difficult if the only thing you can sort of recall, or the only thing you tend to recall, is that the clouds are parting, because that's not always the case. Here's an example where it's clear that the clouds are parting. You know what I mean? So if the 10 of Swords were followed by the sun, for example, I would absolutely say that, yep, this is the worst that it's been, and the sun's going to come out tomorrow. There's evidence now in the reading that the clouds are parting because the sun has come out. But if the reverse is true, if the sun is followed by the 10 of Swords, that might make me think that the clouds are actually gathering. And that's a really salient key point for me here, is that it's not that the clouds are gathering or parting, it's that there are clouds. And that's really the thing that I want to talk about, and that I hope you take away from this. And I'll, as I do, kind of reiterate my point over and over again. If you move from the sun to the 10 of Swords, probably there's storm clouds rolling in. So in the image, in the actual image of the 10 of Swords, it's a static snapshot. We can't tell whether the clouds are parting or not because there's nothing giving us context. Rachel Pollack's context was in comparison to the 9 of Swords. Here, it's in context and in comparison to the sun. And so not just the sun, but in the position of the sun. So in this example, the clouds are parting. In this example, they're gathering, right? Because there's storm clouds gathering over. It's the next step in the narrative. In this case, the next step in the narrative is that the sun comes out. So the point I want to make, and that I'm going to keep making, is to try to avoid making value judgments about what's happening in the card, and to try to accept the image for literally what it is, and let the reading tell you what's actually happening. Let's take that further. So here's another example where probably the clouds are not parting. We're going from sunrise here, right, to sunset here. So there is, if we were to look at the card on the bottom, in the middle of the Swords card, there's sort of this yellow sky and these clouds, that are, or night sky that's gathering or receding, depending on your point of view. If what comes next is the moon, then it's nighttime. And so the clouds and the sky are darkening. The action of the card changes because of what's there. So I have some more examples. Here's another one. Now, this is a pretty grim spread. And the purpose, I chose these deliberately, but what I wanted to point out was that when we make a value judgment about a card, it can be really difficult. Now, if what I know about the 10 of Swords is that the clouds are parting, and then I encounter the Tower and death following it, that doesn't work, right? that creates friction that's hard for me to make sense of as a reader. So as a reader, I'm telling my client, okay, the clouds are going to part. This is the worst that could happen. And then I have two arguably worse cards that follow. The Tower and Death are pretty grim in this combo. As a new reader, for example, or as a reader who's really committed to the clouds being parted, I have to work harder to make sense of how the clouds are being parted and things are getting better when the Tower and Death come along. Now, I'm making value judgments about the Tower and the Death in order to do this example because I'm assuming that they're negative, right? But they're not, they are what they are. But in the context of this spread, there's not a whole lot of good happening, and the clouds may be parting, but what comes next is just as bad. So a storm may pass and leave the rubble of disruption, and something may really be good and over. The clouds don't really seem to be parting all that much, and if they are, what the light is revealing is worse than what we thought it was going to be. So, this is not a trio of cards we probably see much in readings. But again, my point is that the value judgment on the 10 is based entirely on something Rachel Pollack wrote in contrast to the 9 that has stuck and become a part of the 10, even when it's in other situations. Here's a situation where it's different. The clouds might be parting in this case, right? The destruction happens and you wake up and you see things have gotten the way they are and it's pretty bad, but maybe the clouds are parting. In this case, that might be another example too. The clouds are parting, you're still stuck in the rubble, but you wake up and you come out on the other side. Now, all of these are going to depend on the question too, which is something I haven't really factored into the equation here, but that's another piece of the puzzle. The way that the cards interplay, not just with each other, but with the question you're asking, that always matters, and it's always going to bend the card meanings. But again, you can see that the way that the clouds part and what happens after they part and what they reveal has so much to do with the context, and so the sun may be coming up, or it could be the sun going down. Things could actually get worse. The clouds may be gathering for a real big storm, or you could be waking up from a storm and feeling the battle wounds of what you've been through. So yeah, here's a case where I might say that this person might have the clouds parting, but they are going to go through a really difficult time in adjusting to that before they kind of come into the world again. This is all about nuance. This is all about sort of thinking beyond what we think the cards mean. And again, I always feel like I have to say that when I make these videos, this isn't me saying that I do this right and I do it better, because I make this kind of I don't even want to call it an error because it's so common. I do this all the time, even when it's not a Rider-Waite-Smith reading. If I'm working with a Marseille deck, for example, and I have the 6 of Swords, like the keyword for me that I always reach for 6 is beauty. And so I'll go to the 6 of Wands and say, oh, the 6 of Wands is about like doing something beautiful, creating something you're really passionate about. But that may come in context of something that's not working, and so I have to look beyond my keywords, right? And that's really what this is about. This is really where I'm trying to get you to think, is to sort of go beyond the keywords. Here's more examples. This is a case where probably the clouds are parting, where things are getting better. We come through, we have a sense of hope, and then we have the 9 of Cups, which is called the Wish card. So this might justify, in contrast, the 10 of Swords, the Star, and the 9 of Cups, a much happier outcome, right? A much more pleasant, clouds parting, the storm is past, the sun is coming up kind of feeling. Now, I want to get into the same thing from the other point of view, okay? So the 9 of Cups is frequently called the Wish card. And I had to go back and figure out where that came from. And as the earliest reference to that I could find was Eden Gray. And that book is her sort of famous... Oh, let me see if I have the title here. I should have written out the full title. It's on my iPad. Let me look. The Complete Guide to Tarot by Eden Gray. So she is the first writer who I have found to call it the wish card, although I've read it many times since. Rachel Pollack does not call it that. So she says, Eden Gray says, this is the wish card. If the 9 of Cups comes up in a querent spread, he will get his wish. The picture here is of a well-fed, well-satisfied man who has neatly managed all 9 of the cups of plenty in a row behind him. Now, I really worked hard to make sure that I wasn't shitting on anybody and like setting up this video. Eden Gray, absolutely a pioneer. We probably would not have tarot in America in the way we do without her writing. So, but what this does is exactly what I'm talking about, which is what it makes value judgments about the cards. If we put the cards in context, then things might change. This is not a wish fulfilled, I would say. This to me is someone who is an alcoholic, for example, or who has a drinking problem, right? All these 9 cups, temperance, and the devil. This is someone who cannot find temperance, who cannot balance things out, or who, when they do, goes back to excess. That's not a wish. And even if it were, you know what I mean? Like, contextually, this might be like, shake things up and do something fun. You don't have to be a fuddy-duddy or whatever. Wishes, you know, there's a quote that Truman Capote used in his unfinished book. I think it was St. Teresa of Avila or something, who said, more tears are shed over answered prayers than unanswered ones, which is another way of saying be careful what you wish for. And so, you know, you can call it the wish card and you're going to get your wish. That doesn't mean things are going to work out, right? Just thinking about wishes more broadly. But again, contextually, the 9 of Cups is not necessarily a card of greatness. It could be, depending on the situation. The other cards can affect it. This might be a case, again, of someone who has been relatively balanced falling off the wagon, you know, and going back to drinking, for example. And I use that as an example because of cups being vessels of alcohol, among other things. Here, it's much grayer. You know, here they go from the 9 of Cups to the 8 to the Hanged Man. And so it's like you try to leave this behind, this thing that you have, and you can't. You know, again, when it comes to the 9 of Cups, I often think of it as maybe more addiction related than the devil, because if you look at the image, they're actually walled in. They're like totally in jail by these cups, right? And so this spread and the last couple seem to represent to me addiction more than the devil does, although with the devil in context that takes it even further, right? And so this might be someone who can't shake an addiction, and it doesn't have to be alcohol. It could be anything. It could be drugs. It could be sex. Again, the question and the situation tells you more, but you do get a sense here that this is not necessarily a wish that you want fulfilled, if that's the way you go. And then, you know, we bring the 10 of Swords in, you know, this fall from grace, in essence. You know, they may find themselves on top of the world or having all the parties, and then suddenly not, and then the clouds gather, you know. An alternative way to look at this, if you look at the 5 of Swords, and the 10 of Swords, the 5 of Pentacles and the 10 of Swords, is there is an actual storm in the 5, and in the 10 there isn't one. So that is an example where you could say the clouds are actually parting. So contextual clues really matter. You have this fall from grace, and yet things get really bad, but the clouds do part, the snow melts. So context really, really is so much more important than anything we think the cards mean. And the more rigidly we stay married to whatever keywords or associations we have for the cards, the more opportunity we have to miss how they dance together and how they talk to one another and how they create harmonies and canons and melodies and counterpoints with one another. If we sort of create a blank slate for each card and allow them to engage with each other, reading gets easier. It also gets more accurate because you're more likely to tailor the meanings to the situation and not force the situation to meet the meanings. And what I mean by that is, you know, the classic example I always give of a reading I did when I was starting out, and someone wanted to know about their love life, and I got the 8 of Swords, and it was something like, no, your love life isn't important. You have to go work on your novel. That's an oversimplification of what I said. But in essence, it was like, that's not what the reading about. The reading's about this. I am a firm believer, and I have said this many, many times, that the situations in which a tarot reading veers from the question are really rare. And that 99.9% of the time, the cards that you drew answer the question that was asked entirely, and that's so important to me. The Magician is another example. And so, this is something we talk about the Magician a lot. The Magician has all their tools laid out. They've got everything they need to make things happen. They're ready to start manifesting. Now, the Magician for me was entirely shaped by Rachel Pollack's writing. Not just in 78 Degrees, but in a couple other books where she talks about how the magician does manifest and draws energy through themselves and into the act. There are times where that makes perfect sense, and there are times when it doesn't. And so, if in this context we were to say the magician has everything they need, maybe that's not true. The magician may not have everything they need, or they may be deficient in some deeper way. You know what I mean? And so again, saying they have everything they need, they have all their tools laid out in front of them to do the things they need, that is a thing I've said many, 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 many times. And yet, in this context, that may not be true. There is a need here. There is a want here. And so I have to reconcile that. So how do we do that? Well, I think one activity that's really helpful is to look at the way we describe the cards. Okay, this is a description I wrote, but it's a pretty standard issue tarot book, tarot deck, little white book description of the card image, right? So what I wrote here was, a slain figure lies on the ground, gutted by 10 swords. Blood drips out from his corpse, or from this corpse, who hasn't just been killed, but overkilled. That's something I stole from Rachel Pollack. She also says, it only takes one sword to kill somebody. This person has 10. The single visible hand makes a magical sigil. There is a placid water with blood-red waves in the background. A low, that should say mountain, not maintain range, looms in the distance. And beyond that, the sun comes up. Its yellow light signaling a new dawn. The dark skies part, it's over. So that's a pretty standard issue description of the 10 of Swords, right? That's something we probably read something like over the years. What I recommend doing is describing the cards this way. So I have crossed out everything that is a value judgment. All right, so you can see here. So a figure lies on the ground, 10 swords stuck in the figure, blood, a single visible hand, blue water, red waves in the background, a low mountain range, it's yellow sky below, dark sky above. So I have stripped away all of the assumptions, all of the value judgments, all of the indicators. A figure is on the ground. They're struck by 10 swords. There's blood. There's a visible hand. There's blue water with red waves. There's a mountain range. There's a yellow sky and a darker sky above it. That is what I'm seeing in this image. Anything else that I'm seeing in this is judgment. It's an imposition of meaning onto the card. By doing this, though, what you start to do is look at the card from a completely neutral way. You take away that the clouds are parting or that they're gathering, and you have this image of just this. A figure on the ground with 10 swords, there's some blood, a hand is visible, there's water, there's mountains, there's a yellow and black sky. Taking all the value judgments out lets you start from neutral. It lets you see the card in a different way, in a way that is more than just whatever we've imposed on it over the years, And if you're anything like me, you've imposed a lot because I've read a lot of books. I love reading tarot books, and I've gathered a lot from a lot of places. But what I need about this card is the essence of it. It's the same thing here with the 9. So we can do the same thing. A happy-looking figure with a satisfied grin sits before an array of golden cups, signaling his achievements. A blue tablecloth on a curved table, blue symbolizing peace and tranquility. The red hat and socks mean he hasn't lost his passion, even though he's got it all. Okay, yes, that is probably a little bit more of a specific description of the 9 of Cups, but it's not an uncommon way of looking at it. But what are we seeing? A figure sits before an array of golden cups, a blue tablecloth on a curved table, red hat and red socks. That's what we've got. We've got a man in front of a table, assuming it's a man, right? That's a value judgment. That's an imposition. The gender assignment of the card. A person sitting on a table, sitting on a bench in front of a table. There's 9 cups. He's wearing a hat. They're wearing a hat. They have red socks and shoes. That's what this card is showing me. Everything else is an imposition. Now, I'm not saying you have to strip meaning away from everything, but just to look at the cards from a neutral place and just say what you see, what's literally there, not what you think you see or what someone has told us we see. To just look at the card and say, this is what is on it. Here's the Magician. A yellow sky, white tunic, red robes. One hand holds a wand up, the other points down. A table with inscriptions carved, roses and lilies in the foreground. A wand, a sword, a cup, and a pentacle on the table, a lemniscate overhead, a snake biting its tail is the belt, the Roman numeral 1. And the reason that I suggest doing that is not to unlearn everything you've learned. You're going to carry that with you, and you should. All of that is going to be meaningful at some point or another. But the point here is to distill everything and free it from all of the value judgments we've made about it, so that when we come to a spread of cards, no matter what the spread is, we're able to see a narrative that goes beyond the assumptions, and we're able to make it make more sense and sweat less. If in this spread, if the 9 is the wish card and it's followed by 2 kind of negative cards, well, that's hard for especially someone starting out to make sense of. But if we accept that all of these are neutral, then it's a little bit less crazy, because the 9 of Wands is not any happier than the 5 of Pentacles or the 10 of Swords. I'm sorry, I kept saying 9 of Wands, the 9 of Cups. This is a different situation, and it's going to be impacted by what we're reading about. If this is a question about a love life, it's going to be different than if it were a question about a job, if it were a question about pregnancy, if it were a question about a legal matter, right? All of those things are going to change the way that these cards are read. And so we have, and this is one reason why I felt very drawn to pip cards for so long, is because it's easier to sort of transcend the things you think you know about the cards as you're making combinations, because even the images are value judgments, right? We didn't come to the 10 of Swords saying the clouds are parting just because Rachel Pollack once wrote it. She got that from somewhere. And it's because the card looks like that's probably what's happening. It's not easy in the 5 of Pentacles to see anything good happening there. But if we are able to describe it from a neutral state, there's snow, a stained glass window, 2 people, one of them is injured. They're both not well clad in clothing. That's it. And so it just neutralizes a little bit. It's not saying poverty. This could be a play. This could be people acting. This, you know what I mean? We don't know. The context of the question is going to make so much more sense. And so if the question is, what did my year at work look like? Then that's a very different situation. It's someone who probably starts out feeling high on the hog. They might actually suffer a job loss and get really depressed. If this is a question of, how do I approach this novel I'm stuck on, then it's a different story. It's okay. Your character starts out doing really well in love, and it's a love story. And then they meet someone, on the street. Like, you know what I mean? The context will change everything. I'm not talking much about questions in this case because I do that a lot. The thing that I really want to be able to have folks take away from is not to rely too hard on the judgments that we make about a card, and to allow the image to tell us what it is in the context of the reading, rather than us telling the reading what the card image means. You know what I mean? So that's really the key. It's not so much that the clouds are parting or gathering. There are clouds. This is a picture where there's clouds. And that may mean different things in different situations, in different contexts, and different questions with different card combos. And so all I'm really trying to get you to do ultimately, and to keep doing myself, is to start from there, to start from a neutral space. There are clouds in this card. And depending on what comes next or before or after, that's going to change what's happening. And that's really where I'm going with this. So you won't forget all those meanings if you sit down and try to free yourself from them. You know, the sun's another good example. I mean, they're all good examples, but you know, the sun, very traditionally happy card. But again, contextually, is that always the case? There's no shade in this picture. You cannot escape it. This is a naked baby under the harsh sunlight. You know what I mean? It is not probably going to survive very long that way. You know, there's no water, there's no food. Well, I guess there's sunflowers, but I don't even see sunflower seeds on there. They look like they've been picked dry. You know what I mean? Like, the sun is always supposed to be a happy card. Sometimes it puts a spotlight on stuff we don't want to see. Sometimes it's too hot. Sometimes it's too much. Sometimes it's too bright. You know? So ultimately, that's the thing. It's going to depend on the context. It's going to depend on the other cards. And if we just are able to say about a card rather than the clouds part, you know, a sun shines in the sky. Even shines feels a bit of a judgment, right? The sun in the sky, sunflowers, a baby, a horse, a flag, a wall. You know, that wall looks pretty impenetrable, doesn't it? All of those things are things I may not think about until I sit down and just describe literally without judgment. And then I'm able to see all these layers in the card. Like, why is that wall there? You know, is this always good? Is that baby locked in that garden? Is this Icarus and Daedalus? You know what I mean? So you just start to see the cards more deeply by starting from seeing them just as they literally are without any just descriptions. So anyway, I hope this helps. I hope this was interesting. It's always fun for me to talk about this stuff. This was a tough one. I spent a few days trying to kind of articulate it. And again, this isn't me saying this is the right way and this is the way you have to do it. This is me saying, here's a thing that's valuable, that has been valuable for me, that could be really valuable for you. And I wish I had known this sooner. You know, I wish I had gotten this lesson when I was starting out. I feel like I probably would have been more confident, because putting the puzzle pieces together would have been easier. It would have made more sense for me. So there we have it. Hope you're well, be good, and talk to you soon.